Welcome to the second in our series on propaganda and democracy. Last session, we talked about the history of propaganda, and today we'll talk about how propaganda today is fueling the greatest amount of violence the U.S. has seen since our Civil War. In fact, according to the FBI today, there are more than 2,700 open terrorist investigations, twice that of spring 2020, right after January 6th. Since the FBI's search in Mar-a-Lago last week, groups like Proud Boys, the Three Percenters, and Oath Keepers have been using right-wing radio and social media to declare war against the FBI, IRS, and law enforcement. For the last 5 years, ever since Charlottesville, one thing we've experienced more than ever in this country is how much words matter. In fact, as we've seen, words kill. Understanding what's going on here with these extremist groups, and especially what we as communicators can do about it, is the theme of today's discussion. But first, let me recognize the organization who made today's show possible: the Grady College of Communication at UGA, Amazon, Pat Ford, Page, Muckrack, and Compro.
Thanks, Shelley. You're right. The timing of this event is fortuitous. I think our original plan for this event was really to focus in on the past, right, with January 6th assault. But obviously, things have changed now. And so the events of today, I'm sure, will be a big focus of the conversation. I'm from the RAND Corporation. RAND is a nonprofit, nonpartisan research policy center that's really keenly been interested in these topics. I've been here 18 years, God help me. We have helped the U.S. confront virtually every form of violent extremism, from Al-Qaeda to ISIS to now this domestic variety. The line between fact and fiction in American public life is becoming blurred, extremely blurred. And this has really helped foment a new generation of Americans that are flirting with extremism and have certainly partly led to the January 6th assault at the U.S. Capitol. So RAND calls this phenomenon the truth decay, and our researchers are studying its causes, consequences, and how to counter it. So now, without further ado, let me introduce the panelists that we have here today. First is Seamus Hughes. He's the Deputy Director of the Program on Extremism at George Washington University. He's author of the book Homegrown, ISIS in America. He contributes to a lot of news outlets, as do all our panelists here today. And in this year, as a matter of fact, he was part of the New York Times team that won the Pulitzer Prize for their reporting on law enforcement in America. He does a lot of work, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, helping journalists uncover stories hidden in the vaults of our justice system. Before this, he's worked at the National Counterterrorism Center, and well as served as a counterterrorism advisor at the U.S. Senate Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee. Next up is Colin Clark. He's the Director of Research at Soufan Group and Senior Research Fellow at the Soufan Center. I'll also say he's a former Randite. In fact, he's a current adjunct at RAND. And prior to joining Soufan, he was professor at Carnegie Mellon, political scientist at RAND, where he did a lot of amazing work in transnational terrorism, insurgency, and criminal networks. And his most recent book is After the Caliphate: The Islamic State and the Future of Terrorist Diaspora. And finally, Pauline Moore is a political scientist at RAND. Her research focuses on violent extremism, targeted violence, terrorism, and counterterrorism. She's the author of Politics of Terror, which came out in 2018. And she's also one of the key authors on RAND's most recent report on violent extremism, mapping the white identity, terrorism, and racially or ethnic motivated violent extremism. So, hey, everyone, thank you all for being here. Today, I organized the moderated portion of this in three parts. First, we're going to talk about where are we right now, and we cannot ignore the current state that we're in right now with a recent attempted attack at an FBI field office, and other events that we'll talk about. And then after we talk about how we got here now, where are we now, we're going to say, how do we get here? And then we'll go back to what was originally the focus of this event, the January 6th attack at the U.S. Capitol, and other events that contribute to today. And then finally, what do we do about it? So without further ado, we'll get started. Let's start with where are we now? And I think to do that, the best place to start is with Seamus. Seamus, you had an interesting tweet last week we observed that we are living in a fractured threat environment for the foreseeable future. What does that mean?
Yeah, I guess that was the only interesting tweet I had last week, I think. So first of all, thank you to Rand for having us, and Todd and Shelley in the Museum of Public Relations. So when I talk about fractured threat, what do I mean by that? I mean that 5 years ago, you could probably safely say 90% of the counterterrorism approach was looking at ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and foreign-based extremism. Fast forward to January 6th, you see a shift in resources and an upping of things. And so you have 1,000 active investigations in all 50 states for ISIS cases and Al-Qaeda. You've got what was 800 cases for domestic terrorism. It's now 2,700 cases of domestic terrorism. That'd be white supremacists, neo-Nazis, that type of thing. And then you have everything in between. So you've got, Proud Boys, you've got Boogaloo, you've got involuntary celibates, you've got single issue, and then you just got people that just want to watch the world burn. And as we saw that in clear distinction last week, right? So you had a sectarian, what appears to be a sectarian murders in New Mexico, targeting Shia Americans. You saw the attack on Rushdie. You saw the attack at the FBI building by a purported January 6th, probably Proud Boy attack. And so what you have, if you're law enforcement, is like, this isn't simple anymore, right? There's something to be said about having just one organization with the territory the size of the UK that you can really focus your resources on. But if you're dealing with a whole range of threats, a fractured nature, and it seems to ebb and flow depending on the day, and they play off each other, right? The white supremacists and neo-Nazis play off the ISIS guys, and back and forth in this endless cycle of reciprocal radicalization. It gets messy very quickly. And finally, I think probably the most interesting and concerning part about it is this ideological fluidity, right? You have these individuals who may be purported Proud Boys, but are white supremacists, or Proud Boys that aren't white supremacists, or incels that are also supporters of Boogaloo, or everything in between. They kind of pick and choose their own adventure on extremism. That means that if you're law enforcement, you're going to be up on all of the ideologies you're looking at. You've got to be on multiple different platforms to understand what's going on. You've got to run a series of sources on it, and everything gets really, really complicated quickly. And this is in an environment where you've seen an attack on law enforcement, not only in trust, an attack on media in terms of trust, and then resources are just not being allocated the way that they should be when you're looking at this nature of a threat. That seems very negative. I apologize. The happy news is
wanted
the lovely day outside.
Yeah. Colin, why don't you take it a little bit further? Earlier this year, you talked about the mainstreaming of extremism beyond an organized core. Back in the day, we were focused on Al-Qaeda and supporters of Al-Qaeda, but it's to take a cue from Seamus, it's obviously got more complicated than that. But what does this mainstreaming mean?
So first, I just would like to thank Rand and the Museum of Public Relations for the invitation. This is the type of stuff that Seamus and I and Pauline and others think about all day, every day. And I also agree with Seamus's characterization of the threat. I think two and a half years ago, Bruce Hoffman and I wrote a piece where we called the threat kaleidoscopic, right? It no longer looks the way that it used to, and it's coming from all these different areas, and completely agree with fluidity of the fringes and ideological convergence, what some people call a salad bar ideology, right? I'll take this, I won't take that. And just, kludging together various strands of different ideologies in a way that, we really hadn't seen before. And so I think that's a big factor. When I talk about the mainstreaming of the threat, I'm really referring to the entire gamut of, what folks call the far right extremist ecosystem. And that's everything from Telegram, Gab, some of these really, pretty heinous platforms, or the platforms themselves aren't necessarily heinous. It's what's happening on them, and the type of speech that we see, all the way up to some of the things that we see on Fox News on a regular basis. Things like the Great Replacement Theory, right? And downplaying the aspects of violent white supremacy that have seeped into our mainstream culture. This isn't about being politically correct or not being politically correct. It's about not being a racist and not spreading white supremacist extremism on a regular basis. and propaganda that radicalizes and incites people to physical acts of violence. I've received pushback from some folks, including folks in the terrorism studies community, that says, this is Chicken Little saying the sky is falling. There is no mainstreaming. And I've pushed back in due con, and would be happy to have that debate. Even if you look at folks like General Hayden, who came out the other day and referred to parts of the ecosystem as both dangerous and nihilistic. And I think that's exactly the right characterization, and evokes also the group of individuals that Seamus referred to earlier, who want to see the world burn, so-called accelerationist, right? Which is not necessarily a new ideology, but it's been repackaged for the modern era. It's been quite effective.
Shortly after the search warrant was served at Mar-a-Lago, we saw a lot on the right wing espouse, support for some sort of violent attacks. And then shortly after that, the attack at the FBI headquarters. I mean, how worried, just focusing on this particular threat, how worried are you guys about this? And Pauline.
Sure. Yeah. Well, let me just clarify. The attack wasn't at FBI headquarters. It was at a field office in Cincinnati.
Right.
Although there have been threats against FBI headquarters, and I think that's been hardened since with fencing and other kinds of obstacles. I'm very worried because and it's hard to talk about these issues without getting into the very partisan nature of this. But time and time again, I found myself pulling Robert Putnam off the shelf and looking at the kind of erosion of social capital in this country, and movements like QANON that have really eroded the social fabric and have destroyed families. And it's something that I've witnessed firsthand, of people kind of going down these rabbit holes of conspiracy theory. And it caused real societal rifts that are very difficult to mend. But when you have representatives in the US government that routinely go on social media and exhort their followers to some kind of action, walking right up to the line, right, without saying explicitly, go attack this person. And then we see things like the Cincinnati attack and people say, oh, I never said to do that. It's really dangerous. And I think, we're in many ways, this has become normal when you see someone in Congress, go online and tweet something very, very provocative. To me, that's a paradigm shift. And we also have the most extreme actors in this ecosystem sucking up the most amount of oxygen, right? Rather than the kind of moderates or people that are trying to work across the aisle. So I don't think we can talk about this issue without talking about the politics, but it's also very difficult when you want to have discussions because it gets so partisan and so vitriolic so quickly. And I think that shuts down the debate. People then retreat to their kind of, their corners, and we don't actually end up making much progress. That's why I see events like today as crucial to, helping our country understand what's happening. And I think, you are exactly right to have democracy in the title here, because too often we fail to understand that that's what's being eroded, is the democratic norms and institutions in our country.
Yeah, and just to add on what Colin said, I mean, the mood music matters a great deal, right? The only difference now is the targeting is different, right? So 2 years ago, it was healthcare workers that were being targeted. Then it was election officials. Now it's law enforcement. And we saw not only the attack or the attempted attack in Ohio, but also the arrest of an individual who was threatening FBI agents in California 2 days ago. You're going to have a number of different, I think it's safe to say, not even safe to say, I know there will be more arrests in the next 2 weeks of individuals who are threatening FBI agents. A number of my former colleagues are taking serious steps to reduce their online footprint, their information on their families, where they live. Law enforcement feels like they've been focused on other people being threatened in the last few years, and now the target's on their back. And that makes for some other issues too, right? Eroding trust on both sides. If you see everyone as a threat, because you feel like you're under attack too, that has second and third order effects that are going to matter a great deal. It may escalate the situation to a point which would not be great.
Pauline, do you have any thoughts on this? And then feel free to opine. And then I have another question for you. That these issues aren't necessarily, this is just not a solely United States problem. How does this look beyond our borders? Pauline?
Yeah, thanks, Todd. I mean, just quickly, a quick note on your previous question in terms of, should we be concerned? Am I concerned personally? The answer is, absolutely yes. And, I would point people, and maybe, probably a lot of the people who are here today have already read this book, but Barbara Walter, who's a political scientist at UCSD in California, has written a fantastic book that really kind of summarizes for the layperson the decades worth of Civil War literature in the political science field, and really does a great job of highlighting a number of essentially structural factors in terms of where we are in terms of our level of democracy in the United States, how our political parties are now increasingly organized around specific ideologies, these types of structural factors that in other countries that have experienced the civil wars that we're familiar with were these really key factors that led to the eruption of larger scale violence. And of course, I think it's also important to remember that civil wars also look very different. Like the troubles in Ireland look very different from the civil war in Rwanda. So when people say are we or are we not headed towards a civil war here, I don't think that is a question that is out of line or overly like exaggeration of where we are today. I think that we might actually absolutely be on a road to civil war, which might not look like our civil war that this country has experienced, but could certainly look like other civil wars that other countries have experienced. So on that positive note, as far as whether or not the threat is contained in the U.S., Todd, in answer to your question, I think the answer is no, and that's especially true when we think about far right extremist violence and where the trends are going globally there. I mean, a number of data sources are showing that there's been an increase in racially and ethnically motivated violent extremist or far right extremist attacks and plots around the world, especially over the last 5 years. What's interesting is that interesting and frightening is that attacks and plots in the United States are largely responsible for this global trend. So what we've seen, especially as far as the movement globally over the last 5 years, is an acceleration of the extent to which far-right extremism is internationalizing, especially across Western countries. And this is, like Seamus and Colin have noted already, we're seeing this largely online, to a lesser extent offline, even though there are certain events that are certainly bringing folks, violent far-right extremists together in person as well. A lot of the discourse that we're seeing online that's related to far-right extremism is kind of staying within national borders. So we're seeing, specific distinguishable local concerns. People from specific countries are talking about things that are pretty localized, but linked to far-right extremism. Where we have seen individuals from different countries coalesce the most is around tropes that white people are being replaced by non-whites. So Colin, I think, made reference to the Great Replacement. So these are the types of narratives and issues: Great Replacement theory, white genocide narratives, anti-immigration tropes that are really fostering more of a transnational following as far as far-right discourse is concerned. Yeah, did you want to follow up on something, Todd?
I think that's great. Thank you. Well, not great. It's really unfortunate and kind of sad, but I appreciate your answer. Let's take a look back now to, I don't know, I can't say this is how we got here, but certainly our last sort of major event was a January 6th attack at the U.S. Capitol. And I had the honor and pleasure of living on Capitol Hill, and I walked over to the insurrection for the afternoon and interviewed a few people talking about hanging people. And so that was interesting. But how did we get to that event? And Seamus, Colin, you've talked about some of the groups. Can you talk about some of the ideologies that played into that?
Yeah. So the usual suspects that we've been talking about for the last year and a half: QAnon, the Oath Keepers, the Three Percenters, the Proud Boys, a smattering of blatantly white supremacist, racist, neo-Nazi folks. We can all, who can forget the Camp Auschwitz sweatshirt guy, and others, although I don't think that was the predominant ideology of the insurrection. And then those with military experience, and I'm sure Seamus can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the number of individuals so far arrested in relation to January 6th hovering around 1/5 or 21%. These numbers change as more arrests come online. That's very concerning for obvious reasons. And then your, individuals or just free agents that were unaffiliated. So a whole smattering of folks that are motivated by, like any individuals that are involved in political violence, a range of grievances, right? Some of these are a bit more fanciful than others, but the deep state, George Soros, a cabal of elites and pedophiles, a lot of this stuff seems laughable until you realize that this is actually motivating people to engage in acts of political violence. We can't get people to come out in large numbers to protest gun violence in this country, but if you tell them that elites are rigging an election that was stolen, they're going to show up. So I think that says a lot about the state of our country and of our democracy. Stop the steal, the narrative that was pushed by the former president himself. I mean, a lot of these things, if you put them in a movie script, I'd say that's just too far-fetched. That would never happen. And here we are talking about them in the aftermath, where people are still clinging to these in the face of zero evidence. In fact, overwhelming evidence to the contrary. So, and here we've got conspiracy theorists, militia, violent extremists. And I think, to Pauline's point, January 6th has had transnational implications. At the Soufan Center, we put out a paper, several months in the aftermath, looking at some of those transnational dimensions. I've been in Europe, I think 4 times this year already, with another couple of trips planned. And governments in Europe are concerned. The Brits, the Germans, the Dutch, not only about the conspiracy theories that are being molded to local contexts, but also about the anti-government extremism that seems to be exported from the United States and again applied to local circumstances there. And I'll close with this. January 6th, as terrible as it was, and it was a terrible, terrible event. It's a real stain on the soul of our nation. Could have actually been worse if you think about the pipe bombs that went unexploded at the RNC and DNC headquarters. So, we were actually lucky in many ways that it wasn't a much bloodier affair.
Thanks, Colin. James, can you riff on this? I know you are steeped in the court records from January 6th and other cases, and I know you say these court records can really tell a good story. Can you talk a little bit more about what you're learning through that?
Yeah, I should get better hobbies, I think is the takeaway from all of that, right? So yeah, so the program on extremism, we've looked at all of the cases similar to what Colin's done. And so you've seen, I think we're at 857 people who've been arrested and from 46 different states. They're old, they're young, they're rich, they're poor, they're kind of all over the map. You've got folks that are college educated, high school educated, no education, everything in between. They come for a variety of different reasons, obviously all circling around this idea of the big steal, right? That the election was stolen and we need to rally around it. And also this sense of dread, right? If we don't go to the Capitol at this day, we're going to lose our republic. And so there's a reason why, if you look at the data set, like 80% of them were documenting their crimes in real time on social media. It's not because they're bad criminals, of which they are, of course, right? It's also that they didn't think they were doing anything wrong, right? You're live streaming the second revolution. It makes sense to do so. You want to document history. And so that plays a huge role. There's a few things to think about in terms of, for lack of a better word, positive things about January 6th, meaning that there hasn't been another January 6th. In many ways, January 6th was basically a perfect storm, right? And I hate to use the word storm when we're talking about QAnon, but a perfect storm of what we're doing, right? You had technology companies not moderating their content the way they used to, or they did for like ISIS and Al-Qaeda stuff. They hadn't really touched the domestic terrorism scope yet. You had mainstream or elected officials, at least, had arguing that everyone should go there, and then just everything coalescing. And so that gets you the soccer dads from Missouri taking selfies in the rotunda. It gets you the Proud Boys. It gets you the Oath Keepers. It gets you everybody, right? You also have the FBI and law enforcement not really focusing their resources at the same way they are now on those groups. And so that perfect storm happened. But we haven't seen a mass mobilization like that since, right? We've seen at the state and local level occasionally on different aspects of things, but not at the national level again. So we take some solace in that regard. But the motivations were varied, and the reasons they came were multiply varied. I am less concerned, I guess. I find it less interesting the Texas realtor who takes a private jet to the Capitol to protest, right? What I'm really interested in is the upcoming trials of the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys, because we're going to talk about whether there's pre-planning or aggressive pre-planning on this, right? Did they organize? Did they have help? What did that organization look like? And how close to the center of the mainstream do we get? Or are we talking about outliers, right? My gut is we're gonna probably pull back the onion and not like what we see underneath. But that's where I think it's maybe the most interesting part about January 6th trials.
Well, we'll stay tuned for those stories. Pauline, what role did the media have in this? Seamus mentioned Facebook, but what can you say about the role of social media, conventional media playing into January 6th?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously the media today means a lot of different things. Like even if you're just talking about conventional media, you've got like the conventional media that is, supposedly the conveyors of facts, as opposed to, the pundits who are maybe less the conveyors of facts and more the conveyors of specific opinions. And then obviously you have social media. So as far as like the role of the media in fostering, not only the January 6th events, but also just enabling and granting a large platform to far-right extremism more broadly, I think that they've, the media has played different roles and has focused on different things. If you think about the conventional media, I think what's interesting to think about maybe, and that's been occurring over the last almost 10 years, maybe a little less than that, is how they cover specifically mass attacks, mass shootings, for example, like the events that we saw, in Christchurch, in El Paso, in Buffalo. I mean, there's a whole number. I think there's been a push over the last X number of years to de-emphasize attackers' identities, to focus more on the victims, to shift away from really sharing details about the act and publicizing manifestos that are often the place where these individuals will publicize these tropes like great replacement narratives and white genocide narratives and things like that. And the idea, right, and the goal is to deny these people the fame and notoriety that they explicitly seek out, and also to the extent, to reduce the extent to which we might see copycat attacks, which we often do in the wake of these types of tragedies. So, I mean, that's something that we can say about the conventional media as far as, violent far-right extremist attacks go. In certain cases, pundits are different, right? Especially some of the pundits that we see on mainstream outlets today. And, oftentimes, unfortunately, they really do bear responsibility when it comes to glorifying attacks, glorifying the perpetrators, ultimately giving them that attention that they seek out. And some are also, making it very acceptable to talk about things like great replacement, and kind of, legitimizing, popularizing these theories to the huge number of viewers that they have. And then there's social media and the internet, right, which has obviously been, and for good reason, been a topic of increasing focus when it comes to understanding how we got to January 6th, and the evolution of far-right extremism more broadly. A lot of these platforms, the conventional ones like Twitter, Facebook, and the encrypted unconventional ones like Telegram, Gab, et cetera, are providing this, unfettered access to extremist content that a broad network of like-minded individuals can access freely, openly. And this is really an unparalleled recruitment tool for violent extremism that makes radicalization, specifically self-radicalization, a lot different than maybe what we've seen in the past. And as we also know well today, like social media creates echo chambers, right? It's built to learn as we use it, and it's therefore directly contributing to these patterns of radicalization. I think what's important also to highlight when we talk about the role that the internet and social media is, what this is all prompting or contributing to is what experts have been calling this shift towards a post-organizational landscape. So people are radicalizing towards extremism through exposure to this extreme content without being part of an organized group. This is really different than what we've seen with other forms of violent extremism, like jihadist terrorism in the past. This propaganda, this misinformation, these extremist ideas that they're all coming across online without needing to reach out to a formal group or organization is really kind of speeding up this self-radicalization spiral and making, facilitating events like January 6th in the way that we haven't seen before.
Thanks, Pauline. So what do we do about all this? Seamus, to start with the policy, U.S. policy. What's the U.S. government doing to address domestic extremism, and is it enough?
So they announced a domestic terrorism strategy about a year ago, so June 2021. It was the first time any administration's ever had a domestic terrorism strategy, which we should take a step back for a moment and think about that fact, right? But that strategy basically had a number of different prongs. The first one was they announced they're gonna plus up their resources. So the Department of Justice and the FBI asked for more agents and U.S. attorneys to prosecute these cases. We've seen agents that used to work white collar crime or ISIS cases being pushed onto white supremacy, neo-Nazi cases. We're seeing cases that would have never gone to a federal level. They would have stayed at a local DA are now being pushed up to the federal level, and prosecutions of, say, interstate commerce threats or things like that. DHS announced that domestic terrorism is now a national priority, which sounds like a nice phrase, but actually means a lot. It opens up the floodgates for grants for state and locals to apply for that. You had a number of different shifts. We basically saw what I would call a sea change in the way we do counterterrorism in this country. If for the last 20 years have been defined by our responses to Al Qaeda and ISIS, the last 2 years have been primarily looking at domestic terrorism and a shift of it. Now, you can't move an entire national security apparatus in 2 years. You just can't, nor should you. We still have those ongoing threats overseas. We saw the plotting and attack, or the plot against Ambassador Bolton last week. So we still have a number of different threats that are happening, but for the most part, the U.S. government domestically has focused inward, looking at those natures of threats. The question is it working, right? And I think the answer can be found in asking the administration, particularly when they're on their way out, right? So we had the DHS counterterrorism advisor about 6 months ago after the strategy came out. I said, how's it going? And he said, it's more complex, it's more complicated, and it's a greater threat environment than it was 6 months ago. Now, that is not necessarily saying that the U.S. government is failing on their domestic terrorism, but it is saying that they got to go quick and they got to adjust quick and be able to adapt quick. And if they don't, bad things are going to happen quite quickly. So I think I hope we'll see a implementation plan come out from the administration publicly. We may see a plus up of resources in Congress, but who knows if Congress can agree, that the sky is blue that day. So we don't know if there'll be an agreement on that. But we have seen a significant change in the way U.S. government prosecutes counterterrorism in this country.
Thanks, Seamus. Let's open up the questions. There's some interesting comments here, so let me ask a few of those. Colin, I'll throw this one at you. Given that you spend your day focused on these issues, given these topics have so much of your daily focus, there must be increasingly so times that this research and this fight seems hopeless. Are there things you do to keep hope that extremism doesn't ultimately win out?
Yeah, it's a good question. I try to keep things in perspective, right? And focus on the fact that we're having an event like this, the fact that, I know that there are, people with integrity in law enforcement at the federal level and all the way down that are really genuinely trying to do their best. But it's hard. It's really hard some days to keep, to keep good, lift your spirits up and keep that at the forefront of your mind. In terms of what we can do to kind of counter this, I always think of, I've testified before Congress on terrorism related matters numerous times. And when you go to Congress and you say something like, okay, here's what it's going to take. It's going to take a lot of money. This is going to take many years, and it's not guaranteed to succeed. You'll be shown the door pretty quickly, right? Because that's not something that's going to happen in an election cycle. And I think we have these longer term issues in our country that we can make progress on, including education, including digital literacy. But it's really hard. Who are the right people? Who are the right voices to convey these messages? I always think of a place like the Ad Council, which has done great work. But as soon as you wade into this territory, hey, you shouldn't spread virulent lies about the election that could potentially result in an insurrection. You're automatically deemed partisan, right? So I think that's been, in my 41 years, this has been the most kind of depressing it's been from a, where is this country going? Have people really lost their minds type of perspective? So there's that. But, at the end of the day, we have our lives, we have our families, and we have Pittsburgh Steelers football to fall back on.
But not this season for the Steelers. It'll definitely be a Commander season. I may, and Colin's pretty Irish, but I think I may beat him out by about a half an inch. And so my melancholy happiness somehow powers through my Irishness, right? Which is history is helpful in this regard, right? We've had ebbs and flows of terrorism in this country and extremism in the country. Think of the bombs going off in the 70s of Weather Underground or Puerto Rican separatists or any variety of different ideologies that go. And we go through ups and downs. And this is clearly a valley or a peak. And so, hopefully you get out of the bell curve and you get back to the normal. But I think, being that most of us are political scientists on this call, looking back on history in a little perspective does matter a great deal, right? The other thing is 2,700 active investigations in all 50 states is unprecedented for the US context for domestic terrorism. Unprecedented. Never had that number of cases. It's still 2,700, right? In a population of 330 million. So the question, that is a separate question. The question of violence, I think, is a manageable question right now in terms of active investigations. There's a larger question about societal ill and societal well-being on these things, and whether extremism is kind of seeped in so much that is a larger issue we need to address. I'd argue yes, but on the narrow question of violence, we may be able to wrap our heads around this.
You sleeping at night, Pauline?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, I was just talking to a neighbor of mine, about this, who's, not a political scientist, completely, her profession is completely outside of this world. I think it's at once comforting and, it's obviously disconcerting, but also comforting to know that people's awareness about where we are currently in this country and what the threat really looks like, where our democracy is going. People are thinking about it more, and events like Colin said, there are more and more events like this that are opening the discussion up to the public. The public wants these types of events, wants to be talking about this kind of stuff. So I think the mobilization of the general public, I think, is something that's reassuring. I think there have been recent political decisions also that have led to increased mobilization, and maybe we're starting to see shifts in projections for midterm elections, for example. So I think that, I guess, faith in our society and obviously in our democratic institutions, to the extent that they have not eroded, is something to certainly keep in mind as well.
There are two questions on political polarization from the audience, and I'll sort of run through both of these and then let y'all take a stab at it. But one talks about the importance of centrist positions in lowering the flames of extremism. Is there a role for political moderates in this space to influence the overall dialogue? And related to that is a concern about increasing polarization among elites and the public. Are those on the far right and far left contributing to a loss of trust in institutions, even if they do not advocate for violence? So just throwing out the broad topic of political polarization, which is a subtitle of this overall series. I'm just interested to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, look, this has been an issue that's been we've been talking about for a long time. I'm pretty sure Jim Thompson, who was Rand's CEO 2 folks ago before Michael Rich, had written a paper on this. So people have been thinking about this. Political scientists have been studying this. It just feels like it's been accelerated. And I think Pauline made reference to this earlier. Even the radicalization cycle has been accelerated, right? What used to take several years now seems like it happens in a matter of months, where people go from 0 to 60. And that's something that I've witnessed firsthand of people in my life, family members, friends that have never, ever talked about politics, just didn't care, that overnight became rabid, either, left wing or right wing, mostly right wing supporters, right? And there's no coming at people with data, facts, and evidence, because then you're just trying to, well, you have a PhD, what do you think, blah blah blah. So the conversation breaks down really quickly, and I think that's the hardest part, is getting out there, speaking to people about actual data, right? This is the world we live in, and immediately being met with a bad faith reaction of, well, what about Antifa? And I just talked about, this isn't Colin Clark's opinion. I'm literally talking about data, and having someone in law enforcement or some kind of other training say, no, you're ignoring all of these other things that happen. So I don't know how to pull us back from the brink of partisanship. I've never been partisan. I don't belong to any political party myself, frankly, but I do belong to a world of empirical evidence and data. And I think talking about that and trying to keep those guardrails up is the only way I know how to kind of discuss this subject without getting overly emotional.
I think
Go ahead. Can you bring us back from the brink of partisanship?
probably not, but I think that, I mean, one of the questions, right, was, is there a role for political moderates? I think, like, absolutely. We want to see these political moderates elevated in one way or another. I just I don't know how to get there, but I think that they have a huge role to play, to the extent that they can, elevate their own platforms to the level that extremists are speaking out and elevating their own platforms. And unfortunately, extremists are really good at doing that. It's not that moderates aren't. It's just that I think they're often drowned out by the two other extremist sides. And I think, a lot of this polarization is being fueled by social media. So I think that there's definitely a role for social media to play, for the government to play, when it comes to regulating or deplatforming certain actors or certain content from social media platforms, all the while also adopting interventionist strategies, for example, by if we could think of a way to insert counter messaging into to Twitter around certain discussions that do bring like this moderate middle viewpoint into play, and make it visible to these people who are otherwise ensconced in these echo chambers of extremism. I think that would really help shape the conversation, get people speaking to each other more, and make room for more more political moderates.
As a former congressional staffer, when I started in Congress, 15, 20 years ago, when we did national security investigations, I was always told that politics stopped at the water's edge for national security. And that played out in real time, because the chairman and the ranking member sat us down in a room and told us to play nice. And it meant that when I had an oversight meeting with, say, Department of Defense or the FBI, and I couldn't go there, my Republican counterpart would go in my stead, and I would trust that she would do a great job and then give me back the notes. I don't see that happening nowadays, right? But let me try to be the forever optimist in this on this. You know, think about the 1800s when we had Charles Sumner being caned by his by a pro-slavery opponent. Like we've had moments of darkness in polarization in this country. We still have it now, but again, we get out of it at the end of the day. It could be my naivete that's coming through on this one, but it could also be my internal optimism. I'm not quite sure.
Seamus, maybe the answer is, to overcome these differences, you grab your neighbor, you get a veggie tray or whatever you call it, crudité, and you sit down and you talk about these issues, and you hash it out. I don't know, but maybe that's me being naive too.
I mean, listen, we've seen a number of kind of political studies that say you're less likely to hate your neighbor if you know who their kids are and that they play baseball, right? And so every once in a while, getting off of social media and getting outside and talking to somebody, it's very hard for me to hate somebody who I also know what their dog's name is, right? So I try not to learn anyone's dog's name, right? So it just depends.
My dog's name is Goose.
No.
Goose Long, but we call him Goose.
I was on a hatred level for you, and now I have to like you again. Damn it.
Hey, Colin, I know that you have done some work thinking about the private sector, and the audience here, communicators, or a lot of the folks on the line are communicators from the PR advertising industries. What do they do? What can they do to play a role in this?
Yeah, well, I think, too often the phrase public-private partnerships is like a buzzword that we throw out there. And, it's like a catch-all to our solutions, like big data. Oh, it's big data. Don't worry about it. It's AI-driven platforms. But what does that actually mean in practice to get government working with the professionals on Madison Avenue? And I think back, not to embarrass you, Todd, but to some of the great work you did in my early years at RAND, enlisting Madison Avenue, where you turn to, ad agencies to think about how can the U.S. government, U.S. military communicate more effectively. I've done similar work with New York City PR firms, looking at how do we measure information operations, right? Because PR firms and ad agencies are among the best at measurement. They have a lot at stake. They spend a lot of money on these things. So I think thinking creatively of maybe, and Seamus gave a great example of, like, we've have all these examples throughout history, right? What have we done then to kind of overcome them and bring together the kind of brain trust of Madison Avenue with the Beltway and thinking through realistic solutions of how we might even begin to make a modicum of progress? Because I think, making that progress is crucial, not only to the current situation, but to showing younger generations, right, that we do care about our democracy, that we're going to fight for it, and that even though we're in some pretty dark days, that there is a glimmer of hope ahead.
Thank you, Colin. What is the role of disinformation in all this? One of the audience members asks, and how can we combat the disinformation that's playing into extremism?
I think that a lot of that will have to bring into play the social media companies. I mean, that's where most individuals are accessing this misinformation, right? Whether it's pushed by whatever their echo chamber looks like, whatever that network that they're connected to on social media looks like. And there's, I think that we need, obviously this problem is a global problem. But given what we're seeing happening in the United States, I think we really need a robust national strategy within this country, as far as countering misinformation, extremist content online goes. And there's a lot that we can draw from. There are a lot of things that other countries have implemented that we can draw on, especially and learn from, especially when it comes to what countries like Germany and Norway are doing to combat misinformation, racist propaganda and rhetoric, extremism online. I mean, they have a much more robust regulatory environment for social media companies. Another, I talked a little bit about counter messaging strategies. So this more like interventionist approach to regulating social media. I think to the extent that we can like infiltrate in social media content, warnings about, consider who the source of your information is coming from. Consider, what other outlets, what other sources are saying about the same topic, things like that. Just, I think continued education around what misinformation looks like and how we might, as individuals try to think about what we read more, evaluate sources, a broad-based campaign to that effect, I think would be really important, as like idealistic as that might sound.
Thanks, Pauline. So we've talked a lot about right-wing extremism, and but it's probably unfair to say that the left is immune from these things, even though some of the statistics don't bear out the same type of problem, probably. But can we just talk about what kind of extremism we see on the left? I'm not sure Antifa is a group in and of itself, but there are people that espouse Antifa. There were attacks, I think, in Seattle against the federal building there. Can we just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'll take that just briefly. I think, Seamus alluded earlier to this concept of reciprocal radicalization. And so as you see a rise in the far right, naturally, you're going to see a rise in the far left. That doesn't mean that these, fringes are equivalent. In fact, a lot of the violence you're seeing on the left is property damage and things like that. At the same time, it shouldn't go unpunished, right? If people are breaking the law, there's got to be, there's a perception that the left isn't punished and only the right is, and there's a witch hunt, and it immediately drags you back into this partisan narrative. So I think applying the law equally across the board is very important. And we're going to continue to see, I think, a rise in, I've written about this quite a bit, and I'm in the process of finishing a proposal for a new book on what does the future of terrorism look like. And I think, some of the issues that motivated left-wing extremism and what Seamus called special issue terrorism in the 1990s are now becoming really prominent again, including climate change. At a certain point, I think people are going to feel that their governments are ignoring them, and may feel that, to get their attention, they need to engage in acts of violence. And so there's a lot of issues. The whole topic of abortion, right, on the left and the right is now a hot button issue that the FBI has called just abortion-related violent extremism. Everything looked at through a partisan lens is going to have extremes on both sides. And I think, if we attempt to stop, one form of violent extremism, we should be attempting to prevent it all, realizing that we're never going to get to that number that we think is right. We're never going to live in a country, especially a country where there's so many weapons, where the number is zero, right? But how do you kind of tolerate risk? How do you tamp down the situation before it metastasizes? And then how do you kind of anticipate some of the issues that are likely to result in real world physical violence?
Thanks, Colin. Seamus?
Yeah, I would agree with Colin on all of those points. But I'd also remind that we, again, go through ebbs and flows, right? So the last time the Capitol was attacked in 1971 was a bombing by a left wing activists or extremists there too. And so we saw in the 70s was a rise of left-wing extremism, and then a tamping down, then a rise of right-wing extremism. So this stuff is going to go back and forth. But you do see it play out in real time. So like when the Proud Boys, rally on the streets in California, left-wing activists will go there to try to protect or engage or get in fistfights with those individuals or docs or any number of things. And they just play off each other back and forth. For the most part, we've seen violence against property. We haven't necessarily seen violence against individuals. But if history is any indication, if you get to a point where you can throw a Molotov cocktail at a courthouse, it's not a far walk to throw a Molotov cocktail to the guy you don't like. And so it is something to be concerned about. I know that that law enforcement has their own kind of category of anarchist violent extremists that they kind of lump everyone into for left-wing extremism. I know they have active investigations. They've tried to take something federal. It hasn't stuck. And so for the most part, those prosecutions are going to happen at state and local levels for now. And again, to reinforce what Colin said, this, I don't want to make an equivalency between the two levels of threat. We're clearly in a moment where far-right extremism is the preeminent violent threat that the country is facing right now.
So with that, I want to ask, because I know you've written about this a little bit there, you mean extremism is always mired in politics, right? Many in the Muslim community felt unfairly targeted by TV policies, that were seeking to counter Al-Qaeda or ISIS. And I know many on the right feel the same way when we're talking about right-wing extremism, so it's not a surprise that those on the right feel targeted, maybe unfairly so. They feel unfairly targeted. And then that leads to waxes and wanes in how the government addresses this. So how can we avoid a repeat of this politicalization, Seamus?
So what I would do is do our best to learn the mistakes of the last 20 years. And I don't mean mistakes in the pejorative way. I mean, they made an honest attempt to try to do broad-based engagement when it came to prevention of extremism. So, don't do drugs campaigns or drink Coke, not Pepsi campaigns when it came to ISIS and Al-Qaeda. The problem is you can't particularly target that in a way that's useful. You can also measure effectiveness. You can't go back to Congress and say, like, this is working because we talked to 500 people at a community center in Denver, because you might not have spoke to the right 500 people. And so what I would advocate for, and I think is the most constitutionally sound, it respects Establishment Clause and First Amendment issues, is to focus primarily on the active investigations where the FBI says, man, I can close a case, maybe I probably need to keep it open, but I also don't have the manpower, nor do I think it rises to a level to throw 6 FBI agents in a van running 24-hour surveillance on this individual. Is there something else we can do? And that something else is one-on-one interventions, right? That is mental health professionals, mentors, you name it, kind of anything you think that would help get that person off the path of it. And we've seen success in that, right? So if you look at the UK channel program, which primarily set up to focus on Al-Qaeda and ISIS cases, has shifted largely to far-right extremism. They've had some success on closing those cases that way. Now they're in an ability to jump in earlier in the process than we would in the US because they don't have the same constitutional protections that we have. But there is an ability to do so. I'd also say if you look at every major attack, I would struggle to find one in the last 20 years where there wasn't a touch point with law enforcement prior to the attack, meaning that there was an active investigation, or in the example of the Buffalo shooter, a school shooting threat, or a number of other things. So these individuals hit the system. The question is whether you do anything with it, right? And I'm not advocating for an arrest of an individual for your neighbor calling in for a tip, but there should be some sort of structure and safety net that we can throw at this thing before we get to 20 years in jail. And that's how I would advocate. Narrowly focus this so you can measure effectiveness. And you may decide after they're all said and done, this isn't that effective, right? We shouldn't do this. And that's fine, but we haven't given an honest effort yet.
Are there things that we can say are effective?
Yeah, and Pauline may have other thoughts on this, but you can measure effectiveness of one-on-one interventions. You can look at like a group like Parents for Peace, which is running intervention programs for individuals, and you can say, yes, that individual is now a functioning member of society who is not down the QAnon rabbit hole as a result of a very labor-intensive approach to that. The downside of that approach is, one, it's not well-funded right now. Two, the US government's not well-equipped to do it. And three, the political risks of that, we're not willing to bake into the system. Meaning that if this goes south, let's say you do an intervention on an individual and you try to change his mind to not like white supremacy or commit violence, and he does shoot up a mall or do something horrific, you're going to be dragged in front of Congress and said, what the hell, right? And so we have to be willing to have, and unfortunately so, a level of failure. Now, we've accepted a level of failure when it comes to having touch points with law enforcement before an attack. We haven't accepted a level of failure when it comes to countering violent extremism or prevention programs prior to an attack.
I think what Seamus just, I mean, I completely agree with everything that he just said. And I think we really need to think more about taking community-based perspectives and intervention strategies around this. There's a huge role for local law enforcement to play in countering this type of violent extremism, and not just local law enforcement, but also local community service providers, whether those are mental health professionals or parent groups or others. The huge problem now is that because we're in this like post-organizational landscape where we're talking about individuals and not groups and organizations, it's impossible to police hundreds of thousands of tweets and other social media posts that might be an indicator of extremism. So I mean, it's all about community engagement, and it's all about increasing the public's awareness of what signs of radicalization might actually look like.
And just to put out an advertisement, Seamus mentioned Parents for Peace. For anybody on the audience line who might have friends or family who are struggling with, what you might see as extremist ideologies, QAnon, racism, right, down that rabbit hole, Parents for Peace offers a nice helpline that you can call to, get advice on how to work with them, or to, possibly develop some sort of intervention to help them. And people do get out of extremism. So just want to put that plug in there. What about extremism in law enforcement? And I guess, Colin, you mentioned this earlier, extremism in the military. To what extent is that a concern now?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge concern, and I know you've done work on this topic too. And this is something that's not specific to the United States. We've seen this overseas with some of our European partners. Germany's really grappling with this issue at the moment, I'll leave that to experts like you of what the policy solution should be, but I'll talk a little bit more about the problem set. And I think Seamus alluded to this earlier with some of the forthcoming trials of the Oath Keepers. People that have military experience simply can serve as force multipliers for violent extremist organizations. They know how to conduct reconnaissance. They know how to conduct ambushes, fire weapons, gather intelligence, to communicate clandestinely. So, when you have groups like that, we have individuals like that with that kind of combat experience, which also, let's be honest, brings a certain amount of street cred to somebody when they join an extremist group. That's really difficult to combat. I always say, what if the Navy SEALs want to start selling drugs in the United States? They're pretty tough to stop them. And I use that analogy because if you think of Los Zetas in Mexico, that's essentially what happened down there. Their special forces guys, became the bad guys, became a cartel, and they outgunned the Mexican authorities in many ways. So I think looking for those, indicators within the military, within law enforcement, is crucial. It's also a bit of a landmine, excuse the analogy, because, what do? You start walking around the parking lot at every military base looking for an Oath Keeper sticker. We have, laws in this country. We have rights under the Constitution, and those need to be respected as well. So it's a really difficult problem set. I have a lot of sympathy for those that are tasked with, with rooting out extremism from the military. But it goes beyond just, at basic training saying, hey, do you have a giant swastika tattooed on your chest? Hey, you're out. It's a lot more subtle than that. The memes today that people, engage in, they know how to kind of thread that needle, right? And to kind of engage in these activities without, looking like Ed Norton from American History X. There's, multiple flavors of these types of extremism. We have to be savvy and educate the decision makers about what these are.
I would just add that I think rooting out extremism in the military is a great microcosm to the larger issue of rooting out extremism in society, meaning that it hasn't gone very well. You had a significant pull of a stand down or announce of a stand down of doing kind of extremism trainings and things like that, and a significant pushback from the rank and file on that. If you've ever sat in those meetings, every single question was, why the hell are we doing this? All right. And so that is a larger point about how we do these programs, right? Those broad-based, get 150 people in a room and your commander is going to talk to you about why you shouldn't be a white supremacist is not the way to get to this issue, right? It is going to be smaller kind of one-on-one things. And it's also the sense of, you saw, based on the interviews that we did, we saw a number of military officers saying, I felt like they thought we were inherently a threat. We were inherently targeted. I signed up to serve my country, and now the assumption is that I'm going to be an extremist, and I take offense to that, right? And then you juxtapose that with, somebody last week being arrested as an active duty Marine who was a member of an Atomwaffen division, right? So there's not a problem there. The question is how you address it in such a way. And my concern now is that DOD had a moment in a window to do some interesting work. That window has closed, and increasingly so because we saw Congress pushing back on these programs at a pretty significant clip. And so I'm not quite sure they get another window for the foreseeable future, barring a major attack or plot.
Thanks, James. Pauline?
I mean, I don't know that I have anything specific, to add. I think, in response to Colin, what Colin said, that, I mean, what I was going to bring up is also the, these like, if you frame it as like yet an additional training that, rank and file service members are going to have to attend, they do it for an hour and then that's it. It's not going to work. And commanders are absolutely, small unit and larger are going to see it as just like yet another box that they have to check. And I think that, maybe the failures of such an approach are a microcosm of what we're going to see at society broadly, but like the problems of, extremism and countering it that we're seeing in the military are also a microcosm of what we're seeing in society. So, to a large extent, if you think about the reasons that people do join violent extremist organizations in the first place, it's service members, as much as anybody else, might just need increased access to mental health services and other types of services that can help, keep them away from those types of milieus. And it's also, it's a building awareness problem, and it's also, they also access social media, so that's probably where a lot of them are also radicalizing. So I don't know that interventions for them as far as like social media is concerned necessarily need to look any different than what we might need for society at large.
Well, let's talk about interventions and the way out. One of the attendees just asked, it was mentioned there is a path out of extremism. What does that path look like? What is generally someone's aha moment where they realize that they've been sucked in by extremist ideology?
I don't know that it's always the person themselves that comes to the realization. That's where, family and friends do come in, right? It's the same with substance abuse or something else, that it's, sometimes it's this crisis point or seminal moment where somebody, reaches this issue. But it's good to know that there's resources out there that are folks that are working this problem set. Like Seamus said, there are people that do leave extremism in every possible form. And so I think, knowing who to connect people with when they do recognize the signs of extremism is incredibly important. And I'll just go back to, what I said earlier, which is a much longer term solution. That's education, right? And but that's also a contentious issue in this country of, what's the right education to teach. That in and of itself is, look at the debate over CRT and, renaming things and not wanting and banning books. I mean, every single issue that we talk about now is now looked at through this prism of, oh, what are you, being woke? Why? Because you want to teach people about the, horrific history of slavery in this country. So it's really difficult to, in the short term, identify these solutions, but knowing that there's NGOs out there like Parents for Peace, and I know several of the individuals that work there. And I think the other part for me, whereas maybe 5 or 10 years ago, the lion's share of the work I did was counterterrorism per se. Now it's really MDM, it's mis, dis, and malinformation, right? Which seeps into all these other areas. And I'll give a slight plug for, we do work with a company called Limbic, which is a data science company. And this goes back to the PhD academic in me. I want to look at the data to see how it's being, distorted, to see how people are kind of coming down these paths. So how do we start thinking about this in a way that's a bit more sophisticated, and not as a boogeyman to scare people? But even that, I mean, just the same way that some of the stuff with the counter-extremism working group and these other things were shut down by Congress, I don't need to revisit the debacle of the Disinformation Governance Board, right? That became a partisan issue, and who's the arbiter of truth, right? Immediately got shut down through DHS. So we can't start working on solutions to problems if we can't even have the initial conversation about what the problems are.
And I would just add, at some point you're just kind of throwing everything at the wall and seeing what sticks. So the reason people join extremism groups are varied, because humans by their very nature are complex. And the reason they leave extremism groups are equally varied, right? Think of like Bin Laden's bodyguard in the 90s. He quit the group and renounced it because it turned out he was getting paid $100 less than the other bodyguard, right? So sometimes it's personal reasons, right? And other times you're looking around the room at some point and you say, why am I sacrificing a goat in Georgia for Atomwaffen right now? This seems silly, right? So people decide at some point to do it. The issue is like, give them as many possible reasons to leave as you possibly could think of. So it can be a counter and alternative messaging. It could be an alternative in terms of employment or support system, or just location and moving, or any number of things, or shut down their account. You want to throw everything at the wall and hope it sticks. And also, just in context, again, this 2,700 active investigations for the FBI, they're going to prosecute maybe 150, 200 of them, which means the vast majority are not going to rise to a level of a criminal act. And most of those people are going to move on with their lives, right? And then are going to veer off. So it's not just inherently that if you're becoming an extremist, you're going to inherently become violent by nature. And so we need to remind ourselves of that.
I was just going to add something pretty similar, but from an academic perspective, I think that that's where there's a pretty big gap in the research and in our understanding is, what do we know about that transition from nonviolent engagement to violent engagement? And there's some people doing work on that, specifically trying to understand, from a social media posting perspective, when nonviolent actors turn to violence. People like Ryan Scrivens are doing a lot of work in that area, and like somewhat unfortunately, I guess what they're finding is that violent actors are a lot less active in terms of posting on social media sites. So, I mean, to that extent, does that suggest that it might be especially difficult to discern, who those people are going to be? It'd be easy if they were like the people who are posting all the hateful language on social media. Usually that's not the case. There's like a drop in their social media activity maybe before the attack. We also don't really understand whether transitions from, say, a conventional platform like Twitter over to something like Telegram or Gab or Stormfront is any kind of indicator of movement towards actual violent action. But there's a lot of work. There's a lot of stuff we don't understand in that area, and a lot of research that could be helpful in that regard.
All right, great. Well, let me throw out two more questions from the audience, and then I will I'll leave it to you all for addressing those as you please, or any other final comments. So this comes from Judy Cushman. I see the level of daily concern about safety about our homes reaching a general level of concern driving political discussion. That is when the short-term political thinkers means there will be action soon, sooner than later. We need to think of a time compression for short-term solutions happening and affecting our expectation for significant change. Polarization is also a result of the short-term demand for action. What do you see as the implications of this observation? And the other one is a bit more simpler question. That is, how are adversaries taking advantage of this? I'm thinking Russian propaganda of sorts. Maybe there are other adversaries that are looking to use this division with the United States, this extremism to leverage against us. So with that, we'll just go down the line. Colin?
I'll take the second question first because it's an issue that I think a lot about, and I think this is red meat for our adversaries. We know historically that the Russians look for the most divisive issues in our country, which is historically related to race, and we basically make it easy for them to further sow societal division. I know you've done work on this in the past, Todd. Our colleague Chris Paul, many years ago wrote the Russian fire hose of falsehood, explaining why this stuff works. And we continue to present the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, other adversaries with multiple opportunities to sow and exacerbate societal division here. So it's something I am very concerned about. I also think there's my hunch for doing this for so long is that there's a lot more happening below the surface that we just don't have actual evidence for. And that's not to say, the Russians are behind every problem in our society, but it is easy for them. It's a great return on investment to merely kind of wade into these debates and stoke the flames. And you know what? It has great results for them because the more we're fighting each other, the less focused we are on what's happening in Ukraine and what's happening elsewhere in the world.
Yeah, indeed. Their 2016 campaign and other content after that was really focused on radicalizing Americans, pushing more extreme political content to politicized audiences. Pauline?
I was just going to add, and Colin did mention this, that I think you're absolutely right, but I think it's also really dangerous to blame this entirely, what's happening here on our adversaries, because that's, this is a very homegrown problem that we have in the United States, and it's more something that adversaries can capitalize on, can take advantage of, rather than shaping entirely on their own.
Thanks. Seamus, want you final thoughts on
Sure, no.
that question, or any other thing?
No, I would agree with Pauline on this one. Our house is already on fire because we set the fire, and maybe for our foreign adversaries throw some gas on it, but we're the one who put the fire on, right? And we kind of need to own that. Now, we've seen some foreign governments attempt to try to stoke the fire. So whether the Iranians sent threatening emails to Democratic voters in Florida trying to get them to vote for President Trump. The Russians jumped into a Facebook group and tried to rally up folks. It's relatively haphazard because that we're just so good at radicalizing ourselves that we don't need anybody else's help on this right now. And so maybe that could be an area to rally around this question of how we stop polarization and radicalization. We find the other, and the other can be a foreign adversary, and say, we need to address this because we don't want to let the Chinese win on this one. But they're not playing that big of a role right now. Unfortunately, it's entirely us.
Well, hey guys, thank you so much, Colin, Seamus, and Pauline. Really appreciate the opportunity we've had to hear from you. I will leave it off with Shelley, but just to note, September 1, we will have a panel that's going to be really focused on what communicators and other Americans can do to preserve democracy by countering propaganda, disinformation, and the rise of extremism. On behalf of RAND, thank you all for attending. Shelley?
Thank you so much, Todd. Great, guys. I mean, this was just truly fascinating. I hope to see you next time, as Todd had mentioned, where we continue this conversation. And thank you once again to the Grady College of Journalism and Mass Communication at University of Georgia, Amazon, Pat Ford, Page, Muckrack, and Compro. Thank you guys so much, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.